What if the most satisfying revenge against a corrupt homeowners association came down to a single clerical error, one that the HOA president himself handed over, signed, and witnessed, while his own paralegal watched in disbelief? Today's story comes from our Malicious Compliance, and it's one of the highest voted of all time. Here's what happened. So let me set the scene. About 30 years ago, the person telling this story, let's just call them Op, bought a large piece of land. Not in the United States, as it happens. This takes place in South Africa, though Op converted all the figures into approximate dollar values so the rest of the world could follow along. And the land Op bought was on the unfashionable end of what used to be a big farm. The pricier plots were up front, near the tarred road. Op got the bit near the back, where a dirt road ran past. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs, and they had ideas about maybe doing some farming one day. That farming never happened. But about 20 years ago, some of the more organized property owners in the area, Op calls them the Organized Owners, or the OO for short, got together and had the area officially designated as a municipal suburb. The local municipality agreed to put in proper tarred roads, running water and electricity, on the condition that a certain percentage of the properties were actually developed. A construction company with ties to the Organized Owners went around knocking on doors, contacting landowners who had plots but no buildings, and offering to build houses at a very reasonable price, contingent on getting enough people to sign up. While all of this was being arranged, one of the Organized Owners approached Op with an offer to buy half of Op's land. Op agreed. The money from that sale came out to roughly 4 times what Op had paid for the entire chunk of land a decade earlier. Combined with a small bank loan, it was more than enough to cover a fairly large, nice house being built on what remained of Op's property. Op moved in and Op's mom moved in too. The plan was to subdivide the land again and eventually build a second house next door for her. Sadly, that never happened. An undiagnosed tumor diagnosed, as Op put it, but too late to do anything about it, took her before the second house could even be started. Shortly after she passed, Op moved out of the property altogether and began renting it out. Now, just a few weeks before Op moved out, the same Organized Owner who had bought half the land started talking about forming a homeowners association. Op wasn't interested and left. A couple of years passed. Then that same neighbor, the Organized Owner who had bought Op's land, got back in touch. There were 2 road entrances into the area by this point. The original tarred road near where the old farmhouse had been, which connected to a fairly busy main road. And then Op's old dirt track back entrance, now properly tarred and connecting to a wide but quieter municipal road. The HOA was pushing to get the original main road blocked off, to improve security and cut down on through traffic, and they wanted Op's road to become the one and only entrance into the community. They pushed for Op to join the HOA. Op said no, firmly and repeatedly, until the HOA finally accepted it. But they still had a request. They wanted to put a welcome sign near the road, and the only practical spot for it was on the edge of Op's property. They also wanted to build a small guard hut right there, a little security booth where a guard could be stationed permanently to monitor everyone going in and out, and they wanted that shed on Op's land too. An agreement was reached. The HOA would mow Op's lawn and pay the equivalent of about $35 a month in exchange for the use of that land. Op was perfectly happy. The property was large enough that the HOA's little footprint barely made a dent, and since the HOA already had a full-time gardening crew servicing the neighborhood, the lawn care cost them almost nothing extra. Everyone walked away content. This arrangement ticked along for over a decade. The HOA got the other main road blocked off, transforming the neighborhood into effectively a gated community with Op's road as the only way in or out. A rent-a-cop was stationed permanently near Op's property. The lawn got mowed. The $35 a month rolled in. Op occasionally got calls from HOA members trying to recruit them as a full member, and Op occasionally said no. The same tenant had been renting Op's house for all those years, and everything was peaceful. Until about 3 years ago. Someone started terrorizing Op's tenant's young daughter, making strange noises outside, firing a gun close to her bedroom window 3 or 4 times over the course of about a month. That is not a small thing. That is genuinely terrifying, and it clearly rattled both the tenant and the HOA. Both parties came to Op with a new proposal. Join the HOA, they said. We'll give you exemptions from the rules, including exemptions from the monthly fees. And on top of that, we'll build a wall around the entire HOA neighborhood, electric fencing, security cameras, the full package. They told Op they'd been wanting to do this for years, but had been unwilling to build on land that wasn't part of the HOA. Op could not see a downside and agreed. Now here's where things start to turn. It took just over a year to get the wall built and everything completed, which is actually quite fast for a project of that scale. And then, almost to the day, exactly 1 month after everything was finished and signed off, Op's tenant received a formal HOA warning about his dog's barking. The tenant pushed back. He told the HOA that while the property was technically inside the HOA now, it was exempt from the rules. The HOA told him those exemptions had been canceled and that he had 30 days to comply. The tenant called Op. Op started opening some mail that had been arriving from the HOA, mail Op had been ignoring, naturally, because Op was supposed to be exempt from everything. What Op found inside was jaw-dropping. The HOA had retroactively canceled the exemptions, not from that day forward, retroactively going back over a year, and with that cancellation came a series of demands. First, Op was expected to pay late fees dating back more than a year. Second, the easement agreement, the arrangement about the guard shed and the sign and the monthly payment had been canceled, and they were retroactively voiding it going back a full year, on the grounds that the HOA contract apparently allowed them to use small unused portions of HOA members' land for the common good, for free. Third, Op was expected to refund all the easement payments they had received over that period. Fourth, Op was being billed for the garden service having mowed Op's large lawn. And fifth, Op would be fined for every infraction the tenant failed to fix. Lawyers got involved, the courts got involved, it became expensive, and at the end of a lengthy legal process, the judge's ruling was essentially this: what the HOA had done was mostly legal. They had the right to revoke the exemptions, but they were required to give 30 days notice before doing so. Not the most satisfying outcome. Op walked to the car feeling bruised. And then, right there in the car park, the neighbor, the organized owner who had bought half Op's land all those years ago, and who was also, it turned out, the president of the HOA, delivered what he clearly intended as a parting shot. He told Op it had been stupid to refuse to join the HOA at the start, because Op could have been a founding member. And then, with what we can only assume was some degree of satisfaction, he said that next time Op should make sure to understand the documents being signed before signing them. He was right, of course, just not in the way he intended. When Op got home, rather than sulking or giving up, Op sat down and started reading. Not just the HOA contract that had just caused all this grief, all of it. The original easement agreement, every document the HOA had ever provided. Op was, by Op's own admission, looking for loopholes, looking for rules to technically break. Ready to become the most compliant, most inconvenient, most meticulously rule-abiding nightmare the HOA had ever encountered. Op didn't even get past the first page. Here is what Op found. While a property's street address is used for all practical, everyday purposes, in South African City records every property also has a unique legal property number that must be used on all formal legal documents. When Op's mom had moved in years earlier, Op had subdivided the remaining land, slicing off a separate plot where her future house was going to be built, but never actually built on it. And when Op had granted the HOA the easement all those years ago, the agreement had been drawn up in reference to that subdivided plot, the little sliced-off piece set aside for the house that never got built. And when the HOA had drafted the contract for Op's membership, they hadn't used the address of the main house. They had simply used the property number from the easement document. They had signed Op up to the HOA on the wrong property. The main house, the one with the tenant, the dogs, the fines, all of it, was not technically in the HOA at all. The HOA contract, as written, applied to a separate, mostly empty plot of land that Op still owned separately. Now here's where it gets good. The very next afternoon, the neighbor organized owner, HOA president, the man who had just lectured Op in a car park about reading documents, drove out to Op's place personally, nearly an hour away. He had 2 documents hand-delivered and signed for, one notifying Op that the exemptions would expire in 30 days, one notifying Op that the easement would no longer be required after 30 days. Op suspects this was a little act of personal malice, making the trip himself to rub it in. Op waited, patiently. Exactly 30 days to the hour after receiving those notices, Op drove to the neighborhood, walked up to the HOA president's front door, knocked, and had him sign for 2 documents in return. The first document informed the HOA that Op intended to build a house on the HOA property. The correct HOA property, the small subdivided plot, the one the HOA had accidentally enrolled, which understandably confused the president enormously. The second document was notice that the HOA had 30 days to remove everything of theirs from Op's land. The guard shed, the parts of the electric security boom that sat on Op's property, the welcome sign, all of it, gone within 30 days. Op delivered the documents, ignored the HOA president's attempts to start a conversation, got back in the car, and drove away. Early the next morning, the HOA's lawyer called. He explained, with what Op describes as an audible smirk, that their equipment would be staying right where it was. Under the HOA contract, he said, they were entitled to use small, unused portions of a member's land for the common good for free. Op's plot qualified. Op waited a beat and then explained that the land was not going to be unused anymore. Op was building a house on it. The lawyer's smirk didn't waver. He said, fairly condescendingly, that building a house purely out of spite would not hold up in court. And here Op absolutely delivered the line of this entire saga. Op told the lawyer, as calmly as possible, that the property in question did not currently have a house on it, that it was, in fact, barely large enough to legally build a single house, and that once that house was built, there would be no room left over for any extraneous buildings or infrastructure whatsoever. Then Op told him to go look up the property number and call back. Op had made sure of this. When subdividing the land years earlier, Op had sliced off just enough to be legal, which turned out to be just enough to build one small house and nothing else. There was no room for a guard shed. There was no room for a security boom. There was no unused portion, not even close. It took the HOA's lawyers nearly 5 days to call back. When they did, they tried a new angle. They said the terms of the original easement meant Op couldn't cancel it without the HOA's permission. Op emailed them a copy of the document the HOA had sent, the one canceling the easement, delivered personally by the HOA president himself, signed for at Op's door. That afternoon, the HOA president invited Op to lunch. His treat. Op said no thanks. He tried again 2 days later. Op said no thanks. Other founding members called, some aggressive, some sympathetic, some pleading. Op said no thanks to each of them. Eventually, the HOA's lawyer called and floated the idea of discussing exclusions in exchange for continued access to the property. Op said no thanks and asked not to be called again. About 9 days before the 30-day deadline expired, a different lawyer called. He said he wanted to, and these are his own words, negotiate a surrender. Op agreed to meet him the next day. Op had already prepared the documents. The meeting was essentially Op walking in, handing over a folder, and waiting while the other side read through it. This was Op's new easement offer, and it was not messing around. Everything from the original agreement was included. But the line about mowing the lawn had been changed to getting the property up to HOA standards and keeping it there. Since the property was now technically inside the HOA, that meant the HOA's own rules applied to whatever they did with it. The monthly fee was no longer $35. It was $500, with annual increases tied to inflation. The original contract had never included inflation adjustments. If the contract was ever canceled, for any reason, the HOA would owe Op a cancellation fee of approximately $7,500. And then came the really elegant part. The contract would automatically terminate 30 days after any of the following events: any disciplinary action taken against Op's tenant, or the property; any complaints levied by the HOA against the property; any legal action taken against the property by anyone in the HOA. In other words, the moment the HOA tried to enforce anything against Op or Op's tenant, the easement would self-destruct. And without the easement, the HOA's security infrastructure fell apart. The boom gate, the cameras, the guard shed, all of it either sat on Op's land or ran through it. Op also included a clause that the lawyer handling the surrender negotiations would be allowed to mediate any future disputes at the HOA's expense, and that the HOA would cover all of Op's legal fees if any legal action was ever taken against Op. Now, Op later admitted having deliberately included some genuinely outrageous terms in the document, things that sounded insane on paper, specifically so that there would be things to concede during negotiations. A way to appear flexible and reasonable while holding firm on the points that actually mattered. The lawyer didn't look happy. He said the proposal sounded unfair, but he agreed to take it to the HOA president. Op reminded him that in 8 days, whoever showed up with sledgehammers would be removing whatever remained on Op's property. That evening, the HOA president called, furious. He said he would never sign the new contract. Op said okay. He said the monthly fee was outrageous and should stay at the old rate. Op pointed out that when the original deal was struck, the area was still under development and there was another road in and out of the neighborhood. Now there wasn't. There was only Op's road, and everything the HOA needed was sitting on Op's land, fully built and operational. The president complained about every clause he could think of, threatened legal action, and eventually told Op they'd be hearing from his lawyer. The next morning, Surrender Lawyer, as Op had taken to calling him, phoned to ask if Op would come to their offices to sign the contract. Op agreed. When Op arrived that afternoon, there was a surprise. Surrender Lawyer was not, in fact, a lawyer. He was a paralegal. He handed Op the contract and asked Op to sign it. He laughed when Op said they'd have to read through it first to make sure nothing had been changed. Under his breath, he mumbled something that sounded like, "I'm sure you would." Op read through the entire contract. Nothing had been changed, not a single word, not a comma. The contract was exactly as Op had drafted it. And it had already been signed. The HOA president had signed it. The paralegal had witnessed it. Op looked at the paralegal and said, genuinely, why did he sign this? It was stupid to sign it. The paralegal's response is one of the great moments of this entire story. He said, I started telling him that signing it would be a bad decision, but he told me I wasn't being paid to think or give legal advice and to shut up, so I shut up. Op asked if the paralegal understood what had just been signed. The paralegal nodded. He said, I asked him if I should have one of the lawyers look at it before giving it to you. He told me that the HOA had already billed enough on this matter, that he'd sign it, and then sue Op afterward once the easement was safe. Op signed the contract. What they didn't realize was, or rather, what the HOA president clearly hadn't thought through, was that with the self-termination clauses in place, the HOA was now essentially locked into being nice to Op forever or losing everything. Any complaint, any fine, any legal action, any official disciplinary move against Op or Op's tenant. Any of it would trigger the automatic end of the easement, and with it the end of the gated community as a functional entity. It took about 6 months for the full weight of this to land on the HOA. When it did, they wanted to sue. Their lawyers told them there was no path to winning. Even in the best-case scenario, a court might void the contract, but the lawyers didn't think a court would even do that. And if the contract were voided, the HOA would simply be back to having 30 days to remove their infrastructure, and then nothing. There was one clause the lawyers were particularly alarmed about, the one saying the HOA would pay Op's legal fees if any legal action was taken against Op. As written, it wasn't limited to the HOA taking legal action. As written, it meant the HOA would be on the hook for Op's legal fees if anyone took them to court. The HOA's lawyers argued that a court would interpret that narrowly, given the context of the agreement. Op told them that was fine. Op was prepared to find out, since the HOA would obviously be the ones challenging it. Eventually, an addendum was agreed on. The neighbor, the HOA president, would personally pay all of Op's legal fees, unless he held no position at all in the HOA. The HOA itself would cover fees if the HOA took legal action. The HOA president resigned from his position at the end of that very meeting. And Op, standing there in front of everyone, politely reminded him that you really shouldn't sign documents you don't understand. He did not look pleased. During the subsequent mediation sessions, which replaced formal legal action as the HOA's way of raising issues, since formal action would trigger the contract's self-termination, something else came to light. Without control of the security boom on Op's property, the HOA would be in breach of its own articles of incorporation and would effectively have to dissolve. They had built themselves into a gated community, and the gate was on someone else's land. Additionally, all the security cameras were wired, not wireless. Every single one of them terminated inside the guard shed on Op's property. Everything, the gate, the cameras, the guard, the whole operation, ran through a small plot of land that Op controlled completely. It was, as Op put it, their way or the end of the HOA. The first mediation session was, by Op's account, fairly entertaining. The paralegal, the same one who had witnessed the HOA president signing a contract he clearly hadn't read, had been appointed as the mediator per the terms of the agreement. He looked, understandably, a bit glum as everyone assembled. Op suspected the HOA had told him to work against Op's interests. So before anything else could happen, Op stepped in and made one thing very clear. Op had agreed to let the paralegal mediate, but there had been no agreement to any binding arbitration whatsoever. If Op felt the proceedings were unfair, Op would leave, and the HOA could take their chances in court. The paralegal visibly brightened at this, apparently relieved to be told he could actually do his job properly. Things went well from there. Now, Op posted this story after returning from the latest in a series of mediation meetings. And the reason for this particular meeting is genuinely wonderful. Op had built a paddling pool on the property for neighborhood dogs. Op had built it personally by hand, dug a hole, packed it with stone, added a concrete finish. Op's own assessment of the result was generous. It looked, in Op's words, well, terrible. It was Op's first attempt, and it showed. The HOA called a mediation meeting. They explained, as politely as they could manage, that the paddling pool was an eyesore, and not just any eyesore, but one situated right at the entrance to the neighborhood, visible to every single person who came and went. They asked Op to fix it. Op asked them to put together a list of exactly what needed to be addressed, and exactly what standards it needed to meet, to be presented at the next meeting. They obliged. The list was extensive. It essentially required the pool to be demolished and rebuilt from scratch. Op reviewed the list carefully, thanked them for their thoroughness, and then asked if there was any way to reduce costs on the required work. They said no, there was no cheaper path to meeting HOA standards. Op thanked them again. Then Op reached into a folder, pulled out a highlighted copy of the easement contract, specifically the clause where the HOA had agreed to get the property up to HOA standards and keep it there, and handed it over, along with the list, and told them that the HOA usually preferred these things dealt with within 30 days. The HOA started to argue. The mediator reminded them that they could not compel Op to do anything without triggering the easement's self-termination clause. They agreed to get it done. A few other things came out during that meeting worth mentioning. The neighbor, the former HOA president, had sold his property about 3 months earlier and was apparently leaving South Africa for Australia. The HOA had successfully sued him for a significant sum of money, holding him personally liable for financial losses caused by his mismanagement during his time as president, all of which stemmed, directly or indirectly, from his personal campaign against Op. Which raised an interesting question. During the mediation, Op learned for the first time that the whole thing had apparently been a vendetta. The neighbor had harbored a personal grievance against Op for years, and the strangest part? Op has absolutely no idea what they ever did to upset him. As Op wrote at the end of the post, the neighbor was right about one thing. In the end, you really shouldn't sign documents unless you understand what you are signing. Op mentioned not being entirely sure whether to continue pressing the HOA. The self-terminating contract, the monthly payments, the power dynamic, all of it is still in place. Op genuinely likes the $500 a month coming in and is willing to play nice as long as the HOA behaves. But Op also noted that the HOA is already so close to the edge financially and structurally that one more well-placed nudge might be enough to push them over. And if they ever do forget themselves, if they ever send another warning letter, file another complaint, or have a lawyer dial Op's number with anything other than good news, all it will take is 30 days' notice, and the whole carefully constructed house of cards comes down. What gets me about this story is that none of the big moves required aggression. No shouting, no threats, no dramatic standoffs, just patience, a thorough reading of a document, and the willingness to let the other side's arrogance do most of the work. The HOA president handed Op every single piece of this. He drove out personally to deliver the termination notices. He signed the contract without reading it. He told his own paralegal to be quiet while he walked into the trap. Every escalation, every overreach, every shortcut he took to save money on legal fees, it all came back around. And somewhere in Australia, presumably, a former HOA president is reflecting on the importance of reading what you sign. What would you have done in Op's position? Drop a comment below, and if you enjoyed this story, hit that subscribe button for more from the Reddit Vault. Thanks for listening.